Nós vamos dar início ao terceiro dia de seminário. Hoje nós temos também dois convidados. O primeiro convidado é o Dr. David Bishop. O professor David Bishop é professor titular da Universidade de Victoria, na Austrália. Foi presidente da Associação Australiana de Ciência do Esporte e trabalha no Instituto de Vida Ativa e Ciência do Esporte. Ele vai falar especificamente sobre a produção de conhecimento na área mais relacionada à fisiologia do esporte ou ciências do esporte e aplicação em situações de modalidades esportivas. Eu gostaria, mais uma vez, reforçar que as palestras estão sendo gravadas, então, portanto, é interessante que vocês desliguem os celulares. Caso isso não seja feito, eles serão retirados, levados à diretoria e só poderão sair de lá com a presença dos pais ou responsáveis. Então, por favor, evitem que isso aconteça. Eu, pessoalmente, irei retirá-los. Lembrando que se eu não conseguir, alguém do meu grupo de estudos o fará. Então, agora nós passamos então à primeira apresentação. Na sequência nós teremos o professor Benoit Bardi e posteriormente eu farei a apresentação dele. I would like to thank you, Dr. David, for being here with us. So, please, it's your time now.
Thank you. Ok, obrigado. I'll try. Eu falo português, mas antes de começar, eu gostaria de dizer obrigado a todos. Everyone here, thank you. Edison, Yara, getting nervous, I'm forgetting people's names. Marcus, Lewis, and also obviously Emerson. So I hope you can hear me. I hope that you enjoy the presentation. It will be a little bit different from maybe some of the other presentations you have seen. So I'm going to focus much more on sports science. And we can start. So this is a little bit of an overview of what I'd like to talk about today in the next 40 minutes. So first, I will bore you with a little bit about who I am. I'll then talk a little bit about the role of sports science in general. And then I think also I'll talk about why I think sports science is important and maybe some ways that we can improve sports science so that the importance of sports science is more obvious. I'll also say, if you want to ask a question during the presentation, if you want me to slow down, if you don't understand something, then please stop me. Okay, so I'll just start a little bit about who I am. And I think this is important because we're going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of sports science. So obviously how I've arrived at some of my ideas is affected by who I am, my life, and a little bit about that. So let me tell you a little bit about my education, and I apologise if you can't see this, but okay. Don't learn English from an Australian. This is how, I think I was very lucky to the undergraduate degree I did. So this is generally how it was structured, and I don't know if it's similar to in Brazil. We had 1 year of foundation subjects. So the foundation subjects, and I've just given you some examples, we almost didn't talk about exercise or sport at all. So we did things like physics, physiology, so not just normal, general physiology. We also did some pedagogy, anatomy, sociology, and subjects like that. Then in the second year, we started to introduce some movement. And so I've just given you some examples. So after doing the physics, we then moved on to do biomechanics. Anatomy, we then moved to do functional anatomy. Sociology, we then did specifically sports sociology. We also did things like history in first year, and then sport history in second year. And I've just for one subject, I guess my expertise, I've mapped it out. So we started off, we did general physiology in first year, exercise physiology in second year, and advanced exercise physiology where we started to have some specialisation in third year, and then maybe something like in the fourth year clinical exercise physiology. So for people who've been working with populations, or maybe sport physiology for people who wanted to work with teams. And I think this is important for what we're talking about, because I think this type of curriculum is disappearing from sport and exercise science. A lot of degrees would not have this type of general introduction anymore, and they would start directly here with the movement, the exercise physiology, etc. So maybe, as I said, so you can get to know me, this is my background, and maybe I'm biased, but I think this is a very good way to do the degree, to have a broader vision of the degree and not just sport and exercise. And this is just, I guess, more of an overview. So this is generally how the degree will work in Australia. So for the first 3 years, normally the students will do an undergraduate degree. And then after that, there's normally a fourth year where there'll be some sort of specialisation. So they may go and do, as I did, do a physical education degree, so to be able to teach in schools. Some people will go on and do clinical exercise physiology. So that would be to work with rehabilitation, maybe people who have heart attacks, strokes, to help them to get better. Or some people will do a master's or research. And I actually did both. So I did undergraduate, then did physical education, decided I didn't like that very much, and then came back and did research. And then from there will be extra studies. So in my particular case, I went for a master's and then did a PhD. And sometimes some people go directly from master's to be a sports scientist, so maybe to work with Sao Paulo, Corinthians, a sporting club, for example. There's also been some discussion, I think, during Howard's talk, about how there's quite a lot of differences between the degrees. Maybe in Australia we're quite lucky because we have a smaller country, but we have a association that represents our degree, and this is Exercise and Sports Science Australia. And a few years ago, when I was president of this association, we introduced an accreditation. So our association goes around and accredits all of the sport and exercise science degrees in the country, and makes sure there's some flexibility, but all the degrees have to have some common elements to be able to be an accredited degree. Okay, so a little bit more about who I am. So once I finished my PhD, I grew my hair and was working as a sports scientist. I then left and worked at the university, where I was working mostly on training. After that, I went to Italy, and I worked for nearly 4 years in Italy, and I got married as well to my wife, strangely enough. After that, I had a little baby girl, so struggling to do work and look after my daughter, as most of us do. And they're just some excuses to show some photos of my daughter. But I think also it's important because as you have children also, then your perspective changes. So maybe before I was more focused on research, hard line, but then when you start to have a family, you start to think maybe about some of the things that David was talking about yesterday. What are some of the implications of the research I'm doing? Is my research going to help people, or is it just going to get me another publication? So that's a little bit about who I am. Apologies to some of the students who saw this yesterday, but this is just a brief video which shows our new institute. So this is where I'm working currently in Australia. So we've built this new building just for sport science research, exercise science research, and physical activity research. So that's the outside, and it really is those colours.
It's beautiful like that?
It is, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Hollywood stuff.
Sorry, this is a little bit slow to get inside the building. So this is the actual entrance where it builds on. It's built onto the rest of the university. Sorry?
Big size, how large?
In square meters, I don't know. There's four levels, and so this is the entrance.
Yeah, just like our portaria here. Entrance. Exactly the same.
And so this is actually part of the building is also the what's called the library. So on the left-hand side is where the library is, but I don't think we're very interested in the library, so we'll go next door into our laboratories. And so it's organised with there's four levels. So the top level is just motor control. So this is the motor control laboratory in there for Marcus. We'll come back so you can have another look at it. The second level is just exercise physiology, mostly. The third level, and this is the biomechanics. So this is the entrance here. We have a 10-metre high door, so we can do pole vault inside with the motion analysis. We have 6 force platforms on the floor. We have some teaching spaces here. You'll notice it's very politically correct, the architects. This is the biochemistry laboratory, so we do everything. We have a small animal house, we do Western blot, real-time PCR, etc., etc. Body composition with the DEXA. There's a full-body scanner. Some psychological testing. Just some more teaching rooms. And so this is the entrance to, this floor is just for the exercise physiology. So we have a strength training area here where we can do not so much training but strength testing, Cybex, etc. Then we have the exercise physiology laboratories.
So I don't know about science, but they have very good regulators now.
We have here, which is very interesting, an environmental laboratory. So we can change the altitude. We can do 4,000 metres, 40-degree temperature, and also humidity all at the same time. Testing there, we have muscle biopsy room to take muscle biopsies. We also have another environmental room where we can do minus 20 degrees. This is the altitude hotel. So we have bunk beds, so 16 athletes can stay at up to 4,000 metres for as long as they would like. Some more teaching. I think to finish, and so this is the motor control space. So it's a large, can be divided up into 3 areas. We have the gantry, so we can put video cameras. We can project onto the walls. So it's mostly for sport, so mostly for skill acquisition rather than motor control per se. And that's just the offices and kitchen, etc. So that's where I'm currently working.
If you do not publish enough, you are sent to one of those chambers.
Exactly. To have a muscle biopsy. Okay, and I put this slide in, so there you have, just for David's benefit, there's our acronym, and there's our little logo. I have no idea what that logo is, but maybe maybe someone can tell me. One of the interesting things, so we have the sport, exercise and active living, and I'm the leader of the sport program. And so one of the things, I put this up just very quickly, prompted by David's talk yesterday, is that one of the things that I was in charge of is to come up with some key research areas. So rather than trying to do research in everything, some focused areas that we would do our research. And so these are the three areas that we've come up with. Nature and nurture, which is all about selecting our athletes, so talent identification, genes, etc. We have another area on preparation and training, and another area which will be the winning edge, which is more when you have elite athletes, what are the things that we can do to take them from being excellent athletes to winning a gold medal? So things like supplements, altitude training. But the reason I put this slide up is because originally I wanted to have a fourth area, which was, I don't know if you can read that, which was going to be the social implications of the pursuit of excellence. And so that would be things like, if we have elite athletes winning lots of gold medals, does that encourage the normal person to do exercise? Sporting casualties. So we always talk about the positive benefits of exercise and sport, but does it also have some negative effects? But I've put that in red because that was seen as a bit of a commie idea, and so that's been scrapped from our key research area. So I think in the context of what we're talking about this week, already even in this example, some of these social sciences are seen as being less important and being pushed aside. And I guess we'll talk about this week whether that's a good or a bad thing. We've also this week done a fair bit of, sorry, just get the video guys to do some work this week about the name. And so we're doing what we've called is sport, exercise and active living. And one of the things I like that we do is that we try and present it as these intersecting areas or circles. And I think that's important because we always have not serious arguments, but we have this argument, no, but that's sport, no, that's exercise, no, that's active living. A lot of the time it's very difficult to separate out those three. And I think again in the discussions we're going to have today and this week, it's very difficult in our area to say something is sport research or something is exercise research or something is physical activity research. Because quite often they may have intersections and things in common. And just to give you an example, so one of the research projects we're doing is the effects of playing team sports on health. So can we use team sports to get the population more healthy? So in that case, there's some sport, there's some exercise physiology measures that we're doing, and there's also some active physical activity measures that we're doing. So I think it's, and I'm not saying that this is the best term, but it's important that we remember, we talk about kinesiology, physical education, I think we have to be very careful not to try and separate it out into different research areas. Sometimes it will be separate, but sometimes there's a lot of overlap, and that overlap is where some of the interesting research gets done. Just one or two more slides on the name, and so similar to Brian's talk the other day, I mean, I've seen quite a lot of change. When I first started, there was the School of Physical Education in the Faculty of Education. We then became the School of Human Movement as we moved to the Faculty of Science. And I think, personally, I like that term. And I think it also, I mean, it's similar to kinesiology. I think what we do is we study movement, whether that's movement for elite athletes, whether that's movement for the general population, whether that's movement in people with diseases or other problems, etc. But a lot of people don't understand that term. If you go into the street and talk to a plumber, a chef or someone and you say you study human movement, a lot of people get a bit confused and didn't really know what that meant. So there's been a trend in Australia now that we have things like the School of Sports Science, the School of Exercise Science, and things like that. Originally, when I started, my teaching career, it was the School of Sport and Exercise Science. And now, increasingly, you'll see that a lot of the faculty is trying to introduce health into their title. And I think that's to try and tap into the money. So the research grants are normally for health research, etc. So you'll see this. Quick question for you. I've put it in blue. There was a lot of debate whether to have sports science in the title or not. And a lot of the staff didn't want to have sports science. They wanted to be the School of Exercise and Health. And in the end, we decided to keep sports science in the title. Why do you think that was? Why did we decide to keep sports science in the title? There's no wrong answers. Exactly. Perfect. Yeah. Most of the interesting thing that happens in Australia and maybe the world, most of the students come to our degree because they like sport, they like exercise, and then once we get them in and we've got their money, then we say, no, don't worry about sport, come and do exercise and health. And so that was the main reason, is because our students, that's the main reason they enroll. I've also, and I'll ask this question as well, I don't know if it's the main reason, actually I won't ask the question, I'll just say, is I think one of the main drivers of this name change is money. And I think Brian talked about this in his talk as well. So when in Australia, what you find is courses that are in education get less money than courses that are in science, because it's seen that you don't need as much money. So that's the main reason for, in my understanding, for nearly all of these changes. We moved from the Faculty of Education to the Faculty of Science so that we could have more money from the university, and we changed the name to include health so that we could try and get more research money from the health agencies. So I think we can talk about that debate quite a lot. Personally, I don't have a problem with that. I think, more money is nearly, maybe not always, but it's good. You have better facilities, you build nice laboratories. I think what we need to be careful of is that as we move away from physical education and human movement to sports science, exercise and health, I don't think that's a reason that we have to get rid of the sociological sciences. You can still make your name change, you can still move faculties, but that doesn't mean that you have to get rid of philosophy of sport, sociology of sport, etc. So I think there are two arguments that we need to keep separate. Don't worry about this, but I just put this up because I think it's sometimes when we have these conversations, we have to also keep in mind the different cultures. And so I think maybe for, we saw Howard's talk, maybe for an American it seems a very good idea to call a course kinesiology. And personally for me I like it. I think it's a perfect name. It means the study of movement. So it's like human movement but sounds more like a science because it's got ology on the end of it. So it ticks all the boxes there. The problem is that in Australia we can't use that term. Kinesiology has been hijacked by, if you can read that, this kind of crystals to balance your energy, energy levels, and what is it? You have to balance your chi levels through the body and things like that. So in Australia, that's what people understand is a kinesiologist. So unfortunately, even though I think it's a good name and it's perfect in America's context, we can't use that in Australia. And it may be the same thing in Brazil for different types of names. So we can't just copy what other countries are doing. So the next part I I'll tell us more about my background. As I said, we've been talking mostly about exercise and health. So today I'd like to concentrate more on sports science. So I'm going to try and talk about these three. So what is sports science? Why is it important, or why isn't it important? And are there some things that we can do to try and strengthen sports science? So my definition of sports science is this: using the scientific process to guide the practice of sport with the ultimate aim of improving sporting performance. And so I've underlined a couple of important things there. So I think it's the scientific process. So sports science, for me, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be in the laboratory doing an experiment, but it's the scientific process. So it means weighing up the evidence, comparing different theories before you decide to do something. And also it's a guide. So sports science isn't perfect. So if we only followed the research, we may not get the best result. You have to take the research, and sometimes, depending on the circumstances, you may alter that. I used to start this with what's wrong with sports science, but I thought I'll take the positive today and talk about what's right with sports science. So as I said, I think, especially in Australia, not quite to the same degree to sociology and history and things like that, sports science tends to get marginalised a little bit, so it's given less importance than maybe the exercise science. But I think sport is really important, as I said before, because it does overlap with the exercise and physical activity. But not only does it overlap, it also has a great influence on some of these areas. So to give you a few examples, most of our research on exercise and ageing originally comes from sport. So people saw that people who continue to do sport when they were 50, 60, masters athletes, we have the Masters Games where you have 90-year-old people running and doing competitions. We see that they were healthier, they were living longer. So that sports science research has influenced that now people are studying why is exercise good for you? How does it prevent sarcopenia? How does it prevent aging? And things like that. So there's a lot of examples of where sports science research and what we learn from sport. We have other people here in motor control. So we see experts on the soccer field. A lot of what we learn about motor control, we've seen skill acquisition in athletes, is now being applied to help people with cerebral palsy and other sports to help with their skill acquisition, their motor control, etc. So I think if you take the sport out of kinesiology, sport and exercise science, I think you're taking a very important component away. And also sports science is where we're at the cutting edge. We're learning lots of new technologies which can then be applied to other conditions. And I think the Paralympics is the perfect example. If you ever have a look at wheelchairs, so the wheelchairs from 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, they're absolutely terrible. But now with the Olympics, and you see these streamlined, they have soft, titanium, lighter materials, the wheelchairs are much better. And I think if you look at the amputees running, it's not that long ago where people had big plastic or wooden prostheses on their leg. But with the sports science research, they've developed more shock-absorbing, much better prostheses for athletes. And you're now seeing that being carried down so that the normal person who isn't an athlete but has some sort of disability now has much better equipment than they would have had if it wasn't for sports science. So I think sports science is important for lots of reasons. Okay, what's wrong with sports science? I don't know if this is what's wrong with it, but it's much more difficult to get money for sports science research. So you see people in exercise and health research who get $1, $2, $5, $10 million grants to look at exercise and health. It's more difficult to get $1 million to look at strength training or something like that. So increasingly in universities, it's not so much your research which is seen as important, but it's how much money you can bring into the university. So you'll see that sometimes sports science is seen as less important. And I think, as I'll talk about later, this has a vicious cycle. So what you see is the very good young sports scientists often leave sports science research and move to exercise science because that's where the money is. And so what we sometimes, and not always, but sometimes that means that the sports science research is maybe of a lower quality because all of the good sports science researchers have moved out of it. And then you have a vicious circle where the grant bodies don't want to give money to sports science because the research isn't so good. So we need to make sure that we keep some of the good, make sure that we have incentives so that some of the best sports science researchers can stay in sports science. And I think sometimes, and I'll talk about this soon, we make the mistake to think that we're unique. But what this is supposed to be, this is the nerds fighting with the jocks. And you quite often have this in sports science, where you have the sports science researcher doing the research, and then you have the coach or the athlete going, the sports scientist doesn't know what they're talking about. The sports science research doesn't help me. It's not very good. So we have this interesting fight, but I'm sure that it happens in other professions. I know when I talk to nurses and people like that, you have the nurses who are working every day in a hospital saying that the researchers in the hospital don't know what they're talking about. And I think in most fields you have that, the practitioners and the researchers, sometimes there's this disaccord. And I'll give you a few examples, and I think this is quite a good one. So this is a guy called Percy Cerity, who was a very famous middle distance athletics coach in Australia, and he coached an athlete called Herb Elliott, who won the 800 metre gold medal and also had the world record at the Olympic Games, and he also coached some other good athletes. And so this is his quote. He says, "There's 8 world records that have come out of this house. What would those silly old professors up at the university know?" And specifically in this case, he was talking about warm-up. There was a professor in Australia who was trying different warm-up techniques with athletes before competition. And this guy, Percy Cerity, gave an example where he said that if you throw some water onto a cat, what happens is the cat runs away and climbs up a tree. It doesn't sit there and stretch for 5 minutes and do some warm-up and then run up the tree. So that was his example, saying, you professors in the university don't know what you're talking about, the warm-up isn't important. And so he said this, and this is why they send people to university. And so, and I'm sure anyone here in the sports science faculty has probably had the same thing, where maybe you talk about the research and the coach says, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I coach athletes. I know what the best thing to do is. And I won't read this, but this is another coach in this time of Australian rules football. And he was saying all of the money spent on sports science is a waste of time and is probably not good anyway, because athletes are still getting injured. They're not... The training that the sports scientist is doing means that they have less time to do skills, etc., etc. So, as I said, I think these sorts of comments are quite common. And I think this is Brian was saying it wasn't too much. He wasn't presenting data. So this is some dodgy data, but with some coaches, I just decided to do a little bit of a survey. And so what I've done here, I just said, how important is sports science to what you do in your job? And so this is the results here. So this is important, very important, essential. And so this was just about 20 coaches. But if you then asked them, and I gave them some examples of sports science research, and I said, how do you think, how do you rate this sports science research? Most of them are, you can see it's not, here there was nothing, here there's a spread. So this is some criticism, and major criticism. So you have this disaccord where coaches are saying sports science is important, but that the research that sports science is doing is not that helpful to what they do. And again, I think sometimes it's really important to contextualize this. So sometimes we think, oh, this is sports science and it's a problem with sports science. But I think it happens in almost any field. And this is a really interesting study that I found. So this researchers looked at 25,000 articles in the top medical journals. And what they found, only 2% claimed to have a practical application. Only 0.4% resulted in a clinical trial. And the number's so small you can't see it. Only 0.004% resulted in a clinically useful drug within 30 years' time. Okay? So this is research that's supposed to be saving lives, is more important, presumably, than sports science.
This is one out of
Exactly. Yeah.
one article.
So one article in 25,000 articles is, in 30 years, is having something that is resulting in a drug that will help people. So I think sometimes when we say sports science isn't helping people, you know, we have to keep that in context. And that's the nature of science. It's not every single experiment is going to lead to something that will help people. And this is another study, and I think puts it in context as well. So they're saying, if you look at original medical research, so even if there's a very useful, good finding, it takes 10 to 20 years before that becomes routine medical practice. So if a researcher discovers that some treatment will save people's lives, it can take 20 years before that becomes common practice in hospitals around the country or around the world. So if this is something that we're talking about saving people's lives, it's probably not that surprising that the research I do today isn't being adopted by a coach tomorrow. Okay, so we have to always keep in place. It takes time. And it's a little bit distressing because I think about it in this way. This is, you know, it's a few years ago, but we won't worry about that. So this is, if I do some of my research now, that's what I'm going to look like by the time that coaches are starting to use my research. That's my dad, by the way. So. But I think, again, we need to keep in mind that there's a lot of sports science research that has influenced practice. And I don't know if it annoys me, but it always surprises me when you talk to a coach and maybe they're interviewed on the TV and they're wearing the latest Nike shoes and they've got their polar heart rate monitor and they've got some Gatorade that they're drinking and they've got maybe some compression garment or something, and they're saying that sports science doesn't help them. And you just, I don't know, maybe sports science is just so present, so ubiquitous that they don't actually notice the sports science research. So I think, you know, polar heart rate monitors started out of Jyväskylä University in Finland and is now a multi-mega corporation. You see, almost it's difficult to find an athlete that doesn't have a heart rate monitor. These have been banned, but all the biomechanical analysis that went in to devise the swimming suits, you know, all of the supplement companies, the supplements, obviously some of them maybe not so good. Running shoes, there's a lot of science and research. So I think we need to, if someone says to you sports science doesn't help, I think we have to stand up and be proud and say, no, there's lots of examples of sports science that does help people. And Brian mentioned the clapskate, and I think for me this is almost one of the best examples of this problem. I won't pronounce his name, Brian can tell us all later. Chanel, you have to say it in a Dutch accent. And he was a biomechanist, and so when he did his research, he thought, so this is the regular skate, and he thought every time they push off, you don't have the force going onto the ice. So he thought, what can I do biomechanically to allow the skate to stay on the ice for longer so that the athlete can push more force onto the ice and presumably go faster? So he came up with this clap skate. So there's a hinge there, and when the athlete pushes off, for a few extra milliseconds, the blade stays on the ice. And I think what's really interesting is, much as I showed you before, it took, I think, 15 or 20 years before coaches and athletes started to use this. And I have a friend who worked with this researcher, and he was telling me, they kept telling the coaches, you should try these skates, they will improve your performance. Coaches, athletes, same thing, what would the silly old professors know? And one day, they got one of the best skaters in Holland to try these skates. And he was just skating around, trying them. And I think he got a little bit distracted and lost in the moment. Then he had a race. And he didn't have time to change his skates. So he went to the race, kept these skates on, and did his best time ever in the first time using these skates. After that, at the Lillehammer Olympic Games, I think the Dutch team was the only team to have these skates. They won every single gold medal in speed skating, and I think every single race they broke the world record. So that, as I said, this was based on science. The researchers thought, what's the best way we can improve performance? But it took 15 years for the athletes and the coaches to accept it. And so that's the difficulty that we have. So I'm going to, before I get the red card, so I need to make sure I leave at least 2 minutes for Benoit to speak. I'll just very quickly go over some, I think one of the problems is, as I said, is as we're losing maybe some of the better sports science researchers, I think we've also lost some of the quality in the sports science research, and we need to look at ways to improve the quality of sports science research to continue to justify the presence of sports science in kinesiology. Okay. I'll skip over this. So, what I'm going to present, so we saw last night some football players, soccer players falling over all the time, so show a real sport. So what I want to do very briefly is this is if you want some more information, it's a model that I've published. I put up here, it's a model, so you can debate on whether it's the best way, but just some ideas on how we may be able to improve sports science research. And it may sound, and I've got an 8-stage model, and I'll flick through it very carefully, but one is that we need to define the problem first. And that may sound like a strange thing to say, but one of the things that often happens with sports science research is that a sports scientist happens to be working with a team, has some data, and decides to publish it. So there's no hypothesis, there's no real reason, it's just, I'm working with the soccer team and I have this information that what they do during training, I'll write a publication. So I think the research, we need to start with the problem. So what is the problem that we want to solve? We need to talk to coaches and athletes, and they can help us to devise these problems. But we need to start with the problem. Oops. After we define the problem, then we need to do some descriptive research. And so this is just describing what exists in the area. So what happens during a football match? What happens during judo? Things like this. But, and there's always a but, I think one of the other weaknesses with sports science is that there's too much descriptive research. Sometimes you will see motion analysis of under 18 football players, motion analysis of under 16 football players, motion analysis of under 20 football players, motion analysis of football players in Germany, motion analysis of football players in Turkey. And the research always says exactly the same thing, but people keep doing it just because they have access to the data. So I think the descriptive research is important, but only if it has something new and interesting to say. I was going to give some examples, but I'll flick through this because we're...
No hurry, Dave. Keep going.
You're being mean to Benoit.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I'm just reducing the low flies.
So just here, so after the descriptive questions, so description is important, but then we need to make sure that we progress through and also look at mechanisms. So then we can start, and it'll be interesting maybe to get some questions. So I think, again, at the beginning I went through who I am, and I'm a physiologist. So maybe this is a little bit specific to physiology, but it'll be interesting to see if it's also relevant to motor control, biomechanics, etc. So then we can start to look at what are some of the predictors of performance. So these are trying to understand some of the factors that are likely to understand performance. Typically, that's likely to be correlation studies. Okay, so we find out, and this is some of the research I presented yesterday, so maybe we find out that buffer capacity is important for performance, or that we have a correlation. But we have to remember that cause and effect conclusions cannot be drawn from correlation studies. The correlation studies is just giving us a bit more of a clue of where we should look at our intention. And sometimes when I'm talking to my PhD students, an example I like to give is that there's a very strong correlation between shoe size and intelligence. Okay? And it's true. You can do a correlation, you have a very nice graph, but why do you think that is? That's why shoes.
Well, it's not about the shoe itself, it's about your feet. So it doesn't matter.
Exactly. You can't fool everyone. No, the reason is that as people get up, so it's mostly with children, as children get older, they get more intelligent and their feet get bigger. Okay? So if you do a correlation between intelligence and shoe size, it's a very good correlation, but obviously you can't, there's not a direct cause and effect relationship. So after you do correlation studies, you then need to do other studies to try and verify your correlation results. So this is where we do some experimental testing of the predictors. So this is strengthening the case. You're always with science trying to build your evidence. So, for example, in that previous study, I talked to some of the people yesterday, we found that buffer capacity was related to performance. So what we did is we did a study where we manipulated buffer capacity and to see if that improved performance. So to try and get some more evidence. So the next stage is if we find out that something is important, we need to try and work out how we can alter that particular factor. So we'll start to do different types of studies. So in that case, what is the optimal intervention to alter your chosen predictor. So if we find that VO2 max is important for performance, we then need to find out what is the best way that we can improve VO2 max. If we find that, I don't know, that processing of visual information is important for accuracy, then we need to find out the best way that we can improve the processing of visual information. So I'll skip over that. We then, once we find out that, we need to do intervention studies. And this is sometimes where there can be some disagreement between maybe the researcher and the coach or athlete. Because I think sometimes we try and do too much research directly with athletes in the field where there's lots of variability and it's difficult to control things. But I think the first research that we do needs to be very tightly controlled research in the laboratory, try and see if there's an effect, and then if we can see that there's an effect, then we can try and apply it to the athletic situation. So this is when we're doing our research, but in ideal conditions. It can be also done out in the field, but it needs to be very tightly controlled. Now, I think this is important because sometimes what we're looking at is very small effects. And if you're doing it with athletes and you're not controlling their training, you're not controlling the diet, you can't control the weather, then sometimes these very small effects are very difficult to see. So you need to look for those small effects in a tightly controlled laboratory situation first, and if you find it there, then you can try it in the field with athletes. Otherwise, there's the risk that you start directly with athletes and you don't see anything. And you don't see anything because there's too much variability, not because your intervention isn't good. This is an interesting one, I think, and we never do this, and I've never done this. We should then need to look at barriers to uptake. And what do I mean by that? These studies examine and evaluate the real-life conditions. So these are enablers and disablers of what you're doing. So, to give you a very simple example, I might do a study and find that training 5 days a week is the best type of training to improve your muscle buffer capacity. And I'm very happy with myself. I think I've done a very great study and the coaches should be very happy. Then I go and talk to the coach and says, well, that's very interesting, but I only have 2 sessions a week that you can train my athletes. So my research with showing 5 days a week is good is never ever going to be used by a coach who doesn't have 5 days a week to train. We might find, try and think of other examples, but so this research is all about what is going to allow a coach or an athlete to use or not reuse your research findings. And often you don't know this when you're in the laboratory doing the research, if you're not communicating with the coach, often you don't know these. I guess it's also, you know, these barriers to uptake is very important in the physical activity setting. So we know that maybe, you know, we try and say 150 minutes of exercise is very important. But then we go and talk to people and say, well, that's great, but I have a job, I have children, I have to clean the house, I have to cook. I've only got 5 minutes a day, or I need to get sleep, or whatever. So we need to look at things that will allow people to do these, to adopt the research that you find. And so a lot of research now in Australia, for example, in physical activity, is how can we design cities so that people can do physical activity? Yeah, I think Sao Paulo is fantastic. If you weren't stuck in traffic for 2 hours every day, you could do 2 hours of physical activity. So in Sao Paulo, a perfect barrier to stopping people being physically active, is the traffic. So rather than doing lots of research on physical activity, maybe we need to do lots of research on where to build a metro or how to build the city so that there's not traffic. Maybe to design a flying car or something. You know, that sort of research may get people more physically active than physical activity research. And as I said, there's almost no research looking at that. And what's important is when I write about this model, is that it's not necessarily a linear model. So you don't have to do step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Maybe somebody has done this research and you can already come in, do a review of literature and start at stage 5, stage 6. But also, once you've looked at the barriers to uptake, then you may need to go back and alter your intervention study based on what is going to stop your research from being adopted. And then, finally, is you can do, I think, we then need to implement those research findings in a sporting setting. So what we're doing this is, okay, in the laboratory I've found that my training, my nutrition, my biomechanical intervention, whatever, is able to affect performance. But what happens when I go into the real life situation? So maybe I'm working with a soccer team that's playing a game Wednesday, Saturday, travelling to another country, maybe in a South American Cup or something. So what happens when I try and introduce my research into the real life of athletes? Does that still have an influence on their performance? As I said before, there's going to be a lot more variability in these studies. So it's going to be more difficult to see an effect, but these results are what we also need to give to the coaches. To do this type of research means that you have to work very closely with the coach and athlete. So sometimes it's easy to be a researcher and have your white lab coat and stay inside your laboratory, but to do this research, you need to be talking to the athletes, working closely with the coach so that you can do it. And you may find that doing this research may then influence the problem that you're talking about. So it may cause you to rethink the problem that you want to look at. So I'll skip over that slide. And I'll skip this so we can get on to it. So this is just a summary. So defining the problem, descriptive research, predictors of performance, testing those predictors, determinants of the key performance predictors, intervention studies, barriers to uptake, affecting our intervention studies, and then doing the implementation, and as I said, affecting the problem. Just very quickly, what's interesting is that maybe a few years ago there was an article, a review article by Mark Williams. So he's a motor control person. And he was, I think if I understood him, advocating something similar. But he had only sort of 3 aspects. So he was saying the first stage is where we capture expert performance. So we try and understand what differentiates experts from non-experts. We then do the mechanistic research, and then we need to also apply that. So, last few slides. Thanks for your patience. So, where to from here? I think we need to teach students and coaches about the need to have a research model. So I'm not saying, you know, we'll start up the Church of David Bishop and everyone needs to adopt this research model, but there needs to be one. So not just do a study here and a study here. You know, there needs to be a process, and you need to think about going from the problem and how you're going to get to doing research that will help athletes. I like the idea of journals, such as the one that I'm editor of, the Journal of Science and Medicine and Sport, having a practical applications, a couple of lines, a paragraph in the article. So researchers can say, okay, this is the practical application of my research. So this is only a model, and it's only about having better science, better information to give to the coaches. But the intervention must always also be implemented. So we need to also look more at these barriers to uptake. We need to make sure we have a good relationship with coaches and athletes so that they know about the research and that they can adopt the research. I'll skip over that. I'll finish with a quick video. The thing I like about that video is that I've given a talk on sports science. There's a good chance that sports science had absolutely nothing to do with that talented athlete scoring that goal. So we need talented athletes. There's lots of other things that are important, but I still think, you know, there is a role for sports science in performance. I need to thank everyone again. So as everyone said, Yara, Edison, everyone here has been fantastic. We've had a really great time, and I didn't want to say that because I didn't want to give the impression that we've just been enjoying the food and the company, but the intellectual discussions with Yara, Edison, Lewis, everyone has also been really great. So I've really, from an intellectual point of view, I've really enjoyed the week. So thank everyone here, thanking my students and collaborators who helped me with all the research, and welcome any questions.
Now we have time for 10 minutes for questions.
So, it doesn't seem that sports science is doing bad in Australia, I mean, because of buildings. So, you are complaining because you are very greedy?
Big whinger.
Yeah.
No, I think, I don't know, but to be honest with you, our institute is very rare, in Australia even. So, and I think it's been good for us that other people have stopped doing sports science. So it means that we can be the main focus and the main. So for me, where I am is fantastic. But to give you an example, before I was working in Australia, when I was working in Italy, and I wanted to come back to Australia, so I sent some emails to some of the best universities in Australia, and I said, you know, if you have any jobs in the future, then please let me know. And quite a few said, oh, thank you very much, very nice CV, but we're not doing very much sports science research anymore. We're doing mostly exercise research, exercise and health. So I think sometimes maybe from the outside, because Australia does well at the Olympics and many other sports, so we have the Australian Institute of Sport that does some good research. But the universities in Australia, there's definitely a push to do less sports science and to do more exercise science research. And as I said, mostly because of money, to get the big national health grants, etc. Try and get $500,000 grants, you need to be doing health research.
So in 20 years, you're going to feel like your father, and probably you're going to be on the other side. I mean, you're going to be the guy who decides where the money should go, because you're going to be probably in a position in the government or science committee. And you think to whom you're going to give the money? To the sports science, health science?
That's a good question. I think there's two answers to that. The first answer is I think that the money should go to the best science, whatever it is. So, and I think that's really important, is that we reward the best science. So, and you know, we've been talking about this, so whether it's a sociological study or whether it's sports science or exercise science, if the research question is excellent, if the hypothesis is excellent, if the methodology is great, the track record is great, then I think that there should be money that goes to that type of research. But on the, at the same time, I think it's very difficult to argue that it's more important to make somebody run fast than to save than to prevent cancer. So I think always, you could make the argument that there needs to be money that goes to health research, and probably more money that goes to health research than sports science research. But I think there's almost no money for sports science research in Australia, but I think there needs to be always some money that goes to research just because it's good research.
But that's not a contradiction. Let's suppose you have $40, $50 million to organize the Olympics, maybe more, and then you don't have research for money for research. This is kind of stupid.
No, exactly. Yeah. So
it doesn't make sense. It seems to me that it's much more an educational problem. I think, at least in Brazil, in general, coaches, if they have very low education level, then they are not sensible to just realize that we do need research to improve performance.
I think that's a really good point, and that's also, you know, when we're talking about barriers to uptake. And I think sometimes, you know, you can do all the research you want, but if the coach isn't speaking your language, doesn't understand it, then it's going to be very difficult. So at the same time that you're trying to do research, one of the best things that you can do is to have coach education courses, educate them about science, and so that way at least you're speaking. So I mean, the coach doesn't have to have a PhD, doesn't need to be a sports scientist, but you need to be able to speak the same language. And I think it's also, you know, I remember when I first started doing research, sometimes I'd go and talk to a statistician, and it was a complete waste of time. But once I learned a little bit of statistics and we could talk a little bit the same language, then I could have a good conversation with the statistician and get the answer that I want. So I think what you said, at the same time that you give money to sports science research, there needs to be some money invested to coach education courses and helping them to understand the importance of sport, and just understanding the language of sports science.
Because I used to say that they don't know how to ask, and we don't know how to give an answer. So we cannot talk.
I think it works both ways. I think one of the, you know, at the beginning when I was talking about who am I, so when I started I worked for 3 years at the Institute of Sport. So I was working closely with coaches, I understood their language, understood their concerns, understood their needs. So I think that's also important is that, and what I try and do with my PhD students, is that they do some stage or work experience with coaches, because it works both ways. That the coach needs to be able to understand the sports science, but the sports scientist needs to understand the coach. And I mean, a good example is that, you know, with my research, I will always have a job. So I can have a crazy idea in the laboratory and I'll still have a job. The coach, especially of a football team, he doesn't know that he's going to have a job next week or next year. And so if you go to a coach and say, hey, I've got this crazy idea, maybe you should try it, he's going to go, yeah, well, that's a great idea, but I'd like to keep my job, thank you very much. So we need to, that's another example, we need to understand the needs and the coach's situation, the athlete's situation. Yeah. No.
So I heard that Edson wants to be able to run a marathon 2 years from now. Okay. So if you had to give him just one piece of advice, I mean, so you only had 30 seconds to help him train for the marathon 2 years from now, what do you tell him?
I would go to a cold country without hills for a start to help your marathon time. I think just want to run, walk. Probably the big problem without training is going to be actually nutrition. So you'll see marathon runners, I'll talk about hitting the wall, which is when their muscles run out of muscle glycogen. So getting lots of carbohydrates before the race will be important. The training-wise, I think I've only got 30 seconds of my time. Is that enough? We'll talk over some feijoada We can talk about it. Actually, I wouldn't recommend feijoada before. Manga juice.
I have 3 questions, but I will choose one because of the time. And by the way, I ran a marathon some 30 years ago. How is it? There is this gap. You mentioned, you gave some examples. You took some research in medicine saying there is a gap of 10 to 20 years. And then you gave the example from the regular skate and clap skate, 15 years. What do you think there is this gap? It's just a kind of misunderstanding? Is that that?
And this is, I think it's a really good question because it's also, it then maybe becomes, and I don't have the answer, it becomes maybe a sociological, psychological question, but I think naturally people are conservative. So, you think of any type of thing, trying to get people to recycle in their house or something, trying to get people not to use their cars. People are entrained in their normal way of life. So I think it's natural conservatism that it takes people a long time to change. I think, you look at a lot of, you can help me, Dave, I'm getting out of my depth here starting to talk about social cultural stuff, but I think if you looked at a lot of political things as well, it very rarely happens overnight. It takes a long time. So I think there's a conservatism. I think there's also the gap between the research and the practitioner. So not always, and the question before is that part of my job is to try and publish research in the best journals in the world. And so a coach probably isn't going to read the Journal of Physiology, Journal of Applied Physiology or something like that. So I think there's part of that. And I mean, also with the demands of my job is I don't get rewarded for publishing in a coaching journal. And so with my limited amount of time, if I have a choice to publish an article in a high-impact journal or to try and publish in a coaching magazine, I'll probably choose a high-impact journal. And so I'm not saying that's right, but I think that's one of the other things, and it's also one of the things I'm trying to do with my PhD students is to get all of them to publish at the end of their PhD something in a coaching athlete journal. So I think it's important that to try and get that information to the coaches. So I think that's one other small thing that we can try and do to bridge this gap. But it's a difficult question. I think, as you saw, I mean, and as I said, if we have that gap of 10 to 20 years when we're talking about things that are saving people's lives, we shouldn't be surprised that we have that same gap when we're talking about making somebody run faster or jump higher.
Thank you, David. So we don't have more time, but we'll have time maybe later. So I would like to thank David for his